Begin, Srilatha.
Okay, so good morning, namaste, salam alaikum, savasdika, and welcome to all of you to this very exciting webinar on feminist organizational capacity strengthening. Before we begin, I just wanted to share with you a few instructions that I think that will help us definitely to enhance our learning and our participation in today's meeting. Sorry, Bron, I think you have to enable my screen sharing.
Okay, just a minute.
Yeah, meanwhile, let me begin. First of all, we wanted to let you know that today we have translations available in Khmer and in Myanmar Burmese language. So if you would like to avail of this, please click at the bottom of your screen. There is a globe symbol and it should say interpretation there. Please click on that and select the language in which you would like to get the translation. So that's first. Second, we have enabled a live transcription on the webinar today. And this is an automatic feature that Zoom provides. But the great thing about it is that at the end of the webinar, you will be able to save the transcription so that if you want to go back and refer to any of the comments or notes of the process, you can do that. And also you will get the transcription of the actual presentations. Thirdly, if we would make a request to our great speakers today, and I know this from having done translation myself, it's really important to try and speak slowly and clearly. I know some people have a tendency to speak very fast, but if you speak slowly, that facilitates the transcriptions and the accessibility for participants whose first language is not English. And we also want you to know that we will be recording the session today, and this will be shared on the IWDA website. And so you would be able to download the recording or listen or have others listen to it later on. Finally, you're welcome to ask questions. We request that as far as possible, you post your questions in the question and answer pane and not in the chat pane, because this helps us as moderators to know what are the questions you are actually raising, say, for the panelists. You can share other comments and things in the chat pane. So please use the Q&A box to post your questions. That is also there at the bottom of the screen. You'll see things saying Q&A. And we will try to facilitate as many answers as is possible within our time limit. So just very briefly to recap, we have translation in Khmer and Myanmar. We have live transcription. We request speakers to speak slowly and clearly. The session recording will be available to you on the IWDA website, and you're welcome to ask questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Now, before we begin, we would like to do a short mindfulness exercise to help us all to remove negative energies that might block our learning and our openness, and to open our hearts and minds to receive today's insights and knowledge and ideas with great awareness and openness. So I'm going to request everyone, especially those who cannot see the English words on the screen. We are going to do a mindfulness exercise called finger holding. Some of you may be aware of this technique. It's a very powerful method of releasing negative energies from our minds and bodies and increasing our openness. Sorry, there's a hand raised. Is there a question about the exercise? 4 participants have raised hands. Okay, can I ask one of you who has raised a hand to put your question up, and we'll try and see if we can respond to it. I'm assuming it's something to do with the translation.
Hi, Srilatha. I'm just trying to work the translation now. So continue on and I'll try and fix it.
Oh, okay. Right. So you want this in presentation mode. Okay. Can you see that? Can everyone see that?
Yes.
Okay. So what we're going to do is hold each finger gently but firmly and pull our hand gently but firmly off the finger. And as we do that, we are going to release particular types of feelings, emotions, and reactions that could block us in different ways. So we'll start with the thumb. Hold it gently but firmly. And if you hold it, please close your eyes if possible. You will feel a pulse. As you hold it, you will begin to feel a gentle sort of throbbing, which shows you how much awareness there is in each of our fingers. Now, as we pull the other hand away from the thumb, along with that pulling away motion, we are releasing worry, anxiety, or any thoughts that may be interfering or blocking us. We move to the next finger, the index finger. Again, eyes closed, hold the finger with your other hand gently but firmly. And as you pull your other hand away, you are releasing any fear, any panic that you may be feeling. Move to the third finger. Again, hold it gently but firmly. And as you pull your hand away, we are releasing any anger, frustration, resentment we may be feeling because of things that have happened this morning, yesterday, the past week. Release anger, resentment, and frustration. Move to the next finger, your ring finger. Close your eyes. As you pull away, you are releasing any sadness, sorrow, guilt, or emotional pain that you are feeling. Now move to the smallest finger, and as you pull away, you are going to release any kind of over anxiousness to perform, trying too hard, pretending. Now move to the opposite hand and we'll repeat the exercise again. Hold your thumb with your other hand. As you pull the thumb away, you are releasing worry, anxiety, interfering thoughts. Move to your index finger, gently but firmly hold. And as you pull away, you are releasing fear, anxiety, panic. Move to the middle finger, hold gently but firmly, feel the slight pulsing, and we are releasing any anger, frustration, resentment that may be hovering in our hearts. Move to the ring finger, close your eyes, hold gently, firmly, feel the gentle throbbing, and as you pull away, we will release sadness, pain, sorrow, guilt. Move to the smallest finger, and as you pull away, you are releasing any over anxiousness to perform, trying too hard, or pretending. Going to be our real selves. Now close your eyes and we'll take 3 deep breaths to fill ourselves with the energy of learning and the search for new knowledge, ideas, and passion for our work. Inhale deeply and slowly. Exhale gently and slowly. Inhale deeply. Fill yourself with that breath. Exhale gently, slowly. And last time, inhale deeply, slowly. And exhale gently and completely. Now bring your hands, cover your eyes, and gently, slowly open your palms and open your eyes with full awareness and openness for our session today. So, I hope that was a good exercise to bring us into the process. So let's begin today's session with our open minds, open hearts, and we begin by introducing my dear friends and fierce, fabulous feminists, Bettina, Baldeschi, and Sudarsana, Kundu, because we are now going to hear from them as they are the co-hosts of the webinar, and they both represent IWDA and Gender at Work, and they will set the scene for us about why we are here, before we move on to hear from our panelists. So let me just say a few words about each of them. Bettina Baldeschi is CEO of the International Women's Development Agency, where she has orchestrated significant organizational shifts, initially as Director of Communications and Fundraising, where she led the transformation of the identity, media profile, and communications of IWDA, and a doubling of IWDA's income, which is no small achievement. Then, as director of IWDA's Individual Deprivation Measure Program, or the IDM, she championed this path-breaking, world-first, gender-sensitive measure of multidimensional poverty. And now, as CEO of IWDA, she leads a reconceptualization of IWDA's strategic role and contribution, and has articulated a third way that draws on the organization's roots in both the women's movement and development. Motivated by the power of collaborations and kindness, Bettina believes deeply in the transformative potential and power of enabling leadership. The opportunities that come when you surround yourself with smart people and working together through difficulty and discomfort. Before joining IWDA, Bettina held executive roles with Oxfam Great Britain and worked with UNHCR in Australia. She holds a master's degree in women's studies, gender and development from Oxford University. So welcome, Bettina.
Thank you. Now
about my dear friend and fellow feminist, Sudarsana. She is an economist by training, and she is the co-executive director of Gender at Work, with which I am also greatly proud to be an associate. She is passionate about organizational and leadership development and has advised several organizations to evaluate and assess the impact of their workplace policies, practices, and most importantly, their culture on gender equality. And she is also a skilled feminist mentor to young women's rights activists. In the past, she has worked with UN Women to lead initiatives that deliver enhanced access to services through governance reforms. She was also responsible for designing and delivering leadership development programs for government institutions and nonprofits when she was at the Indian School of Business, Hyderabad in India. And she has worked for a Fortune 500 company where she pioneered several new organizational development initiatives. Sudarsana has a master's in public administration from Columbia University and an MBA in human resource management from the Xavier School of Management in India. So welcome, Sudarsana. So now let me invite each of you to present your introduction to this wonderful toolkit that you have jointly created. Bettina?
Thank you again, Srilatha. First of all, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we at the International Women's Development Agency work, and pay my respect to Indigenous elders past and present. And I recognize the past atrocities against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people of this land, and that Australia was founded on the dispossession of First Nations people. On behalf of IWDA, I'd like to extend a really warm welcome to everyone joining today. By way of introduction, IWDA is an Austrian-based organization resourcing, diverse women's rights organization, primarily in Asia and the Pacific, and contributing to global feminist movement to advance our vision of gender equality for all. We were established in 1985, inspired by women's rights activists committed to improve the focus and quality of development policy and practice. Our founders actually believed that women must be initiators, influencers, managers, and leaders of development ideas, not just targets and beneficiaries. And so it's this her story that has brought together strengths in the form of deep, long-lasting connections with women's rights organizations, particularly in Asia and the Pacific. Increasingly, though, our efforts to do development differently sees us recognizing the issues in the development paradigm itself and focusing on systemic change as part of the global feminist movement. We see this approach as a third way between international development NGOs and women's funds. We resource the work of diverse women's rights organizations, enabling them by providing support that goes beyond money, and we make our own contribution to feminist movements, leveraging allocational power through advocacy, through knowledge creation, and through knowledge translation. As a feminist organization that is part of the global women's rights ecosystem, IWDA knows firsthand the multiple challenges of resourcing and doing change work. So I'm really extremely pleased to be launching IWDA's latest resource, the Feminist Organizational Capacity Strengthening Toolkit, or FOX for short. It is intended as a contribution to our collective work as we grapple with the difficult task of ensuring that our organizations reflect and support feminist values sustainably so that individuals, organizations, and the work for change actually survives and thrives. Organizations and structure resources to enable action. So for those of us committed to working with and through organization for feminist change, reflecting on power is core work. It's challenging, it's enabling, expressing and amplifying power is actually what we do. And yet we are part of cultures, systems, economies that structure power unequally. We're not separate from them. So our organization must also be a focus of our change work. And this is hard, particularly for women's rights organizations, where so much of our work feels and is vital and urgent. So the challenge is really there in terms of sustaining adequate attention to both external and internal priorities. A few years ago, IWDA convened a workshop of 21 partner organizations across Asia and the Pacific to delve into the challenges of working in women's rights organizations. And collectively, they confirmed the importance of consolidating experiences and challenges as working as women's rights organizations and the resources that support, enable, and sustain this work. So we embarked on the journey to develop the FOX Toolkit, working alongside Gender at Work and with the generous support of the government of the Netherlands. We wanted to address the scarcity of practical resources to help organizations such as ours and the partners we work with to bring a feminist lens to addressing these kind of issues. As Srilatha said herself, this is a painful journey of exploration and experimentation, and there's no templates on offer. So as such, the FOX resources are not prescriptive of what a feminist organization should look like. Rather, they provide frameworks for reflection and pose questions to help organizations come up with their own unique approach to empower us to experiment and embolden us to be creative in challenging and transforming patriarchal thinking. Each of today's speakers is doing this, and I want to thank them all for helping to create the kinds of organization we want to see in the world. I know IWDA can learn from this work, and I hope those of you joining us today take insights from their reflection that will support you in your work. I will now hand over to Sudarsana from Gender at Work to speak more about how the resources were developed and to provide some further insight into the toolkit before hearing from our panelists. So thank you again for being here. Really warm welcome, and over to you, Sudarsana.
Thank you, Bettina. It is such a pleasure for Gender at Work to be here with IWDA and all our other feminist activists who've joined from across Asia Pacific to support the launch of the Fox Toolkit. I speak fast. I'll try to be slow, but just let me know if I'm speaking too fast. Yeah, Braun, please interject. So, as Bettina mentioned, Gender at Work was invited to accompany IWDA on this journey of creation and experimentation and developing a suite of resources that now constitute the Fox Toolkit. From our perspective, since the time the Gender at Work was formed, we've worked with over 150 organizations globally to support organization learning and change processes that seek to promote cultures of equality and inclusion. And from that experience, we know that despite decades of capacity building efforts, organizations with mandates and commitment to women's rights and gender equality around the world have been plagued by scandals of abuse and harassment and really struggle to live up to their feminist values. We're finding that the principles, culture, power dynamics, and systems of organizations into which we pour so much of our work have remained very old constructs that are ill-suited to the transformative change needed to deal with the complexities and challenges of our current realities. Our efforts to rewire existing organizational cultures have met with some success, but this slide back to patriarchal default is never far from the horizon. We are constantly asking, what will it take to build feminist organizations that are centered around cultures of equality, that promote relationships that are founded on love and respect? How do we build consciousness around being connected to the earth, the community, the people we work with, right? And as we started this work with IWDA, and as Bettina mentioned, we knew, therefore, that it is essential for us to create a flexible approach and a set of tools for feminist organizations that will help them explore what feminist organizational capacity looks like in their own context. And from this, to imagine strategies to grow, to strengthen and transform organizations in ways that are consistent with feminist values. Walking the talk on feminist values in our organizations, in all of our organizations, is not easy. And creating safe, engaging spaces for reflection, strategizing is one way to bring our practice in line with our feminist values. And we hope that the Fox Toolkit provides some ideas on how we can create and sustain these spaces. That's essentially one of the core essence of the Fox Toolkit, is thinking about creating safe spaces for engaging within the organization. If you can go to Toolkit, slide 2, the Toolkit includes 6 modules, as you can see. Each of the modules offers a conceptual grounding in a specific area of focus, a series of interactive capacity building exercises, ideally undertaken in a workshop setting, and it has a guide to additional resources and tools. Each of the modules can be picked up and used on their own, or you can structure a full organizational capacity assessment process, beginning with the self-assessment module. The next slide. The thinking and the principles underpinning the Fox approach is outlined in the backgrounder. That brings a feminist lens, gender power analysis to the concept of organizational capacity. We've tried to build on good practice examples from the sector that take holistic approaches to organizational capacity and keep people working within the organization at the center of the capacity assessment processes, rather than approaching it from a managerial or a technocratic lens around capacity development. We've used the Gender at Work analytical framework throughout the Fox, and the Gender at Work framework talks about individual consciousness and capabilities It talks about rules and policies. It talks about social norms and deep structures. And we hope that that framework will help diagnose, strategize, and map the hope for changes in capacity. The framework also helps to surface the less visible power dynamics and structures that contribute the toxic organizational structures. In addition, as we mentioned, there is a guide, the Feminist Facilitation Guide. It brings together lessons and exercises on how we can create safe, engaging feminist spaces for critical reflection on the current organizational capacity that you have and what it would take to build better and stronger organizations. So that's what we're hoping through this guide. As Bettina mentioned, we started off from a process of reflection itself, right? In planning and developing the modules. We interviewed many of the IWDA WAVE program partners to learn about their priorities in organizational capacity strengthening. And from those interviews, we agreed with IWDA on a short list of 3 thematic modules with the hope that others could be developed if we get additional funding. Now, the themes of these modules are probably no surprise to any of you. The first one is around resources for women's rights, which helps individuals and organizational teams to think collectively about resource mobilization in the current context of the ecosystem that we have for funding of women's rights work, which we know is quite challenging. The second is around creating cultures of care and resilience. And it's essentially about helping us think about how do we build connections between the individual and collective care in organizations with really practical examples of actions that can be taken. And lastly, the third module is on leading, governing, and being accountable. And this includes a series of activities to support organizations through connections between feminist leadership, governance, and accountability. Now, each of these modules has been piloted, and we'll hear later in the webinar about one organization's experience using the capacity assessment module. And we hope that the module, organizations will embrace it as their own. They'll use it in ways that are useful to them. And we would love to hear feedback on the FOX module as they get rolled out. We're so thrilled to see the FOX Toolkit launch today. And look forward to the discussion and learning more about how do we do better at living our feminist values in our own organizations. So thank you so much for joining us today, and back to you, Srilatha.
Thanks so much, Sudarsana. Very exciting to hear about the toolkit and the process through which it was developed, which was also very feminist. So now let's move on to hear from our amazing panelists. And we will start with Pisey Lee. Pisey is a co-founder and coordinator of the Rainbow Community Organization in Kampuchea, Cambodia. She is a feminist and a lesbian. She has always worked with grassroots groups and organizations since she was a student, because she believes deeply in the collective power of the marginalized and underprivileged people to transform society as equal, equitable, and just. So, Pisey, our question to you is, in the organizations that you have been a part of and that you have supported, what kinds of issues have you seen that affect the well-being of team members or members of the community? And what are some of the practical things you're doing to try and create cultures of care to respond to those issues? Pisey?
Thank you for your great questions. I think it's trigger our blood, especially mine. I'm working for Rainbow Community Kampuchea, the LGBT-led organization. So I'm sharing the experience from rock experience of practices, not theory-based. well. We learn from theories and reflect and try to practice that. So we are not unique as LGBT people and community. One of the issues we continue facing is trauma, because we have been rejected by ourselves first, and then the families and the communities. So we continue living with fear, being who we are as LGBTIQ person, in addition to who we are as a person and as a citizens, as a woman, as a man, as trans. So, and that's one of the issues, and this is very personal, but oftentimes the feminist groups always said personal is political. And what does it mean? From that personal experience of ongoing challenges of trauma and discrimination and violence we face, we also face as an organization, because we are not a huge organization with lots of funding, with reputation, you know, that everyone want to work with or want to engage or see our issue as the priority if comparing to other social movement issues. So these are the challenges we have to deal with. If our team member continue to be living in fear, living with the feeling of unsafe and insecure, how do we try to cope with that as an organization culture? At ROC, what is important we learned, we had the amazing head and have now amazing board of directors and the management team and team member. We try to practice democratization, space of dialogues and reflection. Many times we work for systematic change of democratic study and government, fairness, justice, which is all about feminist principle. Before I start, not start sharing this, I had a chance to talk to my colleague as well, asking for their reflection and feedback. And I call them, you are my advisor, because whatever today I am sharing, it's about you telling me what is reality within rock culture. So this is the issue of rock member when a team member are not feeling safe, are feeling frustrated, feeling isolated and ignored by the family, by its community and society. How can ROC as an organization reclaim ourselves an organization which is safe, which is secure, which have equal treatment for every team members? Does it real or it's only a lip service? So all the time we use that space when we develop policy, including the policy for healthcare, for emotional, for physical healthcare, you know, that's part of the well-being. When we talk about healthcare, what does it say in the policy? It's about funding. You have to give your staff, which their entitlement to health insurance, for psychological counseling, for a break, for inpatient, for outpatient. Sometimes, and at ROC, we have this beautiful policy, but we have to negotiate. Do we have the money to serve that policy, to make that policy a realization policy for our team members? In COVID time, we have to make sure that we don't work the same as before. We have to put in place the emergency response for health, again, emotional health, physical health to our team. And also the materials, food, you know, and not just going to psychologists, but every day we have to call and check in each other. Sometimes as a feminist, and oftentimes, not even sometimes, we exercise that feminist principle. Sometimes it's very tricky because you live with guilt. You feel all your privileges, and you feel you don't do enough, and you forget to take care of yourself. So if you are a leader, a manager, or a member in a management team cannot even take care yourself, how can you guarantee you can continue practicing and realizing the policy you've been reflecting, discussing, and approving with your own team? For instance, the ROC policy for health and well-being of the team member. So I have been living that guilt for a long time, because the privileges and the power and the authority you have, you will hesitate all the time. Am I doing enough for my team? So it's always the team first, but you are the second. But after that, I learned actually we are together. So if you are happy, if you fail, if you cry, if you've been threatened, we together, it's not you alone. So that's important lesson learned within ROC culture. And if we are able to create that space to talk, to express. One of my colleagues just told me, Bong, she's very young and very enthusiastic, very smart and intelligent and all of that, and committed young activists, graduated from social degrees. She said, this is a reflection. We are practicing the principle of feminism because one, I learned feminist principle, you care about well-being of your team member. You believe in justice and you try to deliver that. You try to do everything in order to achieve justice. And it's about power relation. And I don't see our team member have power over anyone, but actually we try to share that among us. You are the coordinator. That doesn't mean you can decide everything alone. Otherwise, you are a solo leaders, you know. So every one of us share the collective leadership. That inspires me.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I must ask you to wrap up.
Thank you.
You have half a minute to wrap up.
Yeah. So my point here is a feminist organization of well-being and caring. You are able to create a space for every team member of you to speak, to express, to share input. And this is about reflecting about democracy of culture as well. So when we say culture, you don't do it once, you do it all the time, you reflect and you adjust. And we are continue doing this at Rainbow Community Kampuchea. And I'm proud to be part of that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pisey. I think you've given us lots of very powerful insights, maybe the most important, which kind of links to something very strongly in the toolkit, is that self-care and collective care is very political. Yeah, it's an expression of a kind of living democracy. So thank you so much. That's a very powerful insight for us. So let's move on now to hear from our fellow panelist, Michelle Reddy. Michelle is a Pacific feminist and women's rights activist who is the fund manager at the Fiji Women's Fund. She has previously held leadership positions with the Fiji Women's Rights Movement, the Pacific Center for Peace Building and Leadership, and she is a global advisory panel member of the Canadian government-funded Equality Fund and serves as a member of the steering and advisory committees of the Pacific Feminist Fund, which is now in its inception. She also serves as a member of the Technical Advisory Committee of the United Nations Pacific Insurance and Climate Adaptation Program, and she is co-coordinator of the Asia Pacific chapter of Prospera, the international network of women's funds. So welcome, Michelle. And our question for you today is, in your work with the Fiji Women's Fund and in the women's fund sector more broadly, what are the emerging issues and considerations that you're coming across in the funding of women's rights and feminist organizations, particularly now in the context of COVID-19 and the pandemic? Over to you, Michelle.
Thank you. Bulavinaka, everyone. So my sharing is based, of course, on my own experience, which has been greatly enriched by the combined learnings of 8 women's funds from the Asian Pacific region who are members of Prospera International Network of Women's Funds. This include Her Fund, Mongolian Women's Fund Asia, Urgent Action Fund, Asia and the Pacific, TEWA, Korea Foundation for Women, the South Asia Women's Foundation India, and the Fiji Women's Fund, which will now be known as a Women's Fund Fiji. So a key role of the Women's Funds is to mobilize and distribute resources to feminist and women's rights movements. And here's just a few key insights, which are also part of the toolkit. And I'm sure you already know this, but it's good to remember because I constantly use it to remind myself. One is that there is no lack of resources. In fact, there are more and more resources available from a range of sources to support women's rights and feminist organizations. And we deserve a share of those resources. So it's really important for us to move from a sense of frugality and scarcity to that of abundance. I think the third point I really wanted to share today was that everyone in your team is a resource mobilizer, and everyone is a communicator, and everyone is a networker. And so harnessing that collective power would be really important. In terms of our experience as the Women's Fund Fiji in mobilizing resources in a COVID-19 heavy context, it has really meant that we've had to work creatively and flexibly and with a clear intent to ensure holistic support reaches those in need. And how we've done this is by placing people at the center of resource mobilization. So having a deliberate and intentional focus on what are their lived experiences to then guide our resource mobilization efforts. I think what's also really important as a women's fund is to think about supporting a feminist resource mobilization agenda during COVID-19, but also looking beyond COVID-19. And so we're always constantly reflecting and learning and strategizing to ensure that the support that we provide is responsive and also grounded in the realities of our partners, whilst at the same time managing funder requirements and restrictions. For us, we've also looked at our role when we're looking at raising resources in a COVID-19 context. It's closely linked with raising concern and raising awareness about issues affecting our partners. So making more visible the issues that marginalized groups are facing and advocating for those issues to support women and trans rights and communities that are most at risk and marginalized from mainstream funding. Another key learning that we've learned at the Women's Fund Fiji, but also alongside our sister funds from the Prospera Asian Pacific chapter, is to stay in the unfamiliarity, the uncomfortableness a little bit longer. So thinking and analyzing, reflecting, listening deeply to partners, and then developing strategies as a women's fund. For us, we've known that listening to our partners can serve really well in building trust and credibility over time, helping to create powerful alliances and also helping us to have a united voice on issues. It's really important for us when we're creating spaces. One is to create a safe and engaging space, but also asking ourselves whether those spaces are accessible for our partners. So really looking into the tools, especially if it's online tools that we're using, and looking at alternatives. The other thing that's really worked for us is documenting our experiences and learnings, both the achievements, but also being really open about the challenges and looking at ways to work around those challenges. The other one is around not losing focus on other issues impacting communities. So we know that issues such as violence against women, health issues, and access to justice existed way before the pandemic and has been exacerbated during the pandemic. And so it's really important not to lose sight of those issues and to continue to take an intentional long-term view of the problem. This is the other thing that's favorite of mine, is looking at how do you negotiate with funders differently. So as I alluded to earlier, all funders have restrictions on funding, and that leaves critical gaps, particularly around the need for core support and funding. And I think that as women's funds, and I know as women's funds, it's really important to talk about these restrictions, raising funders' consciousness and on why and how these restrictions can be shifted by offering alternatives, and using documentations and learning to negotiate and lobby funders. One of the personal highlights I've had as part of the women's funds is negotiating as a collective or as a consortium, and that is the most powerful because you explore principles that bring you together as a collective. You talk really frankly about what do those principles mean in practice, and what would we do as a collective or as a consortium if those principles are not met. And so for me, being in a room with other sister funds and talking to potential funders or donors was a really personal, powerful journey for me. And I think that that's also important to remember, that in resource mobilization, you're not alone, you're part of the movement. And so co-sharing of resources with other women's funds and development partners and funders is also another key learning. So for instance, if there's a partner that we can't fund directly, we reach out to other funders or look for opportunities to co-support that. And the last one, which is what Pisey talked about earlier on, which is continuing to prioritize collective and self-care, not just for our partners, but also for ourselves. It's a form of resilience and resistance. The last one, I think, before I finish, is just harnessing the culture of local giving. There is a lot of local giving, and learning from Tewa, our sister fund in Nepal, and we also see that in the Pacific. How can we harness the culture of local giving towards women's rights and feminist organizations? Vinaka.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Michelle. Once again, some really powerful points. And I think we have, again, a lot of links to something that the toolkit talks about, especially in terms of how can we engage the entire team in resource mobilization and make it a sort of collective process and responsibility. And also, I think all the points you've made about solidarity and linking with each other so that you can speak collectively to donors with a more powerful voice. I think that is a very, very key point and a very underutilized strategy. Thank you so much. I'm going to rush on now to our next panelist because we are really running short of time. And so it's my pleasure to introduce Betty Barkha, who is a Pacific feminist with over a decade of experience in research, advocacy, and development across the Pacific and Asia. She's been involved with various development organizations in the region since 2009 and is currently serving as an elected member of the board of directors of AWID, the Association for Women's Rights and Development, and the Civicus Alliance. Betty also serves as an advisor to FRIDA, the Young Feminist Fund, and the Global Resilience Fund. She holds bachelor's and master's degrees in arts and is currently pursuing her PhD at Monash University in the Center for Gender, Peace and Security. And she was also recently appointed to the board of IWDA. So welcome, Betty. Our question for you today is, based on your board experience, which is extensive, what changes do you think are necessary to make the boards of women's rights organizations, the boards of women's rights organizations, more feminist in their leadership, accountability, and governance practices? So over to you, Betty.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, everybody. I think Pisey and Michelle have definitely set the pathway so well. So I'll carry on from there. And thank you, Srilatha, for actually opening the session with such power. That completely, well, I was very anxious entering into this because I knew how much value this space holds. So I guess going to the question now, and I'll be quick because I know we're running over time and we want to keep space for question and answers. I think in my experience as a board member, which started when in my mid-20s a few years ago, there was one thing that I learned very clearly, and it was that there is no singular approach, and we feminists know that very well because we don't live singular lives. The intersections sort of complicate it, but also add richness to our diversity. So each organization and each organizational board has its own unique way and process of undertaking what it means for them to be feminist in operations, strategic priorities, and in practice. And I think it's a journey for them all to go through it. So I personally obviously speak from my limited experience compared to everybody else's here, but as a young feminist who came from, who grew up in Fiji and worked a little bit, worked through the ranks and made it to the board. I think for me, it was what felt necessary for a board to be feminist in their leadership, accountability, and governance practices was about recognizing what it meant to be feminist to begin with, and how feminism is dynamic and continuously evolves over time, and recognizing what being a feminist means as an organization, and then putting it into practice is also a different thing. And as Pisey has mentioned, it's not just about talking, it's about walking the talk. So I guess taking tangible action in meaningfully incorporating what being feminist means, and taking an intersectional approach in holistically integrating that, not only in operational and management priorities, but strategically in long-term planning. I think the Fox Toolkit is such a crucial example of something that sort of brings together the wide-ranging ideas and tools. And I'll try not to repeat it, but it's so hard. It's also about recognizing the power within movements, the power outside of movements, and how we sort of shape this power and transform it to work to our benefit. It's also about accountability of who holds the power, who benefits the most from this power, who holds value, whose voices hold more value, and about taking a more compassionate and care-filled approach. I think feminists across the globe have definitely recognized the importance of taking a collaborative, compassionate approach in all of their work. Over the last decade, at least across all of my work, I've witnessed such brilliant collaboration and culture of care. So I guess my very pleasant experience when I first joined a board was that I didn't know what joining a board meant, but I slowly realized that the board was feminist. It was an enabling space in the sense that it allowed me to be who I am and let me grow. It was not only a safe space for me to be a young feminist and understand what the working of an organizational board is, but it also allowed me to ask questions and grow. I think it was also at some stage fun. It became so much fun to me that I enjoyed board meetings so much. And so that definitely added to my interest in staying in a part of that ecosystem, and in sort of being a part of boards and recognizing my role within boards and how I can actively shape that work. I guess what I'm trying to say is, for a board to be feminist, there is definitely no singular approach, and it's a journey. And it takes a village. So there is no one set of rules or one set of guidelines that will be applicable to everybody and every organization. you will have to go through the ups and downs to actually find out what works for you. Most importantly, feminist leadership doesn't have to have a step-by-step guide. And our power is in our reflexive analysis and our flexibility to sort of experiment and explore approaches that work for the best of us. So I think in committing to transforming towards feminist leadership within boards is a huge and ambitious commitment as it is. We are surrounded by patriarchal structures of leadership, so I think it's also unfair to say that if a board is attempting to undertake a journey of organizational change, that it will get everything right in the first instance. And that's also a burden that, you know, is automatically placed on organizations that are trying to transform internally and sort of have ripple effects across their programs. So I definitely think that the process has to be messy, you know, and one of my favorite feminist mentors says the river has to run muddy before it gets clear. And I think that's essential in sort of boards of women's rights organizations becoming more feminist in practice in their decision-making structures sort of going forward. And I think inherently coming towards the end, sort of reflecting on all of my years of being in a board, I enjoy it because there's very clear guidelines on what the role of a board is, but it's also about, if you don't enjoy it, a lot of us who are in this, who do this work are here because we're extremely passionate about it. And we really don't want to lose these people. So it's also about our duty of care and taking a safeguarding approach in all of the work that we do. And the pandemic, unfortunate and, you know, devastating as it is, was an opportunity for many organizations to sort of step back, reflect, rethink, and re-strategize going forward. So, you know, how to be relevant, I think adaptability and agility needs to be embedded. We don't know what the future holds for us, but in committing to a feminist approach towards our work, allows us to sort of be experimental and explorative, like, okay, something we did 10 years ago may not be applicable now. And we may need to rethink this. And I think that's the approach that we need to take. So it is necessary.
Betty, I'm going to have to ask you to wrap up.
Okay,
please wrap
sure.
up. Thank you.
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. Yes.
No, that's all right. And so to conclude is, if an organization is attempting to be more feminist in its practice, it needs to not only sort of decide and be willing to make that change. The change needs to reflect across its work in practice as well. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Betty. I think everyone is very struck with the quote, the river has to run muddy before it runs clear. And thank you for emphasizing that we shouldn't be afraid of the messiness and the muddle our way through to something better. And I think often people revert to the conventional, more sort of tried and tested, but very patriarchal models because of the mess. It's almost like mess is a bad thing, let's run from it, when in fact mess is a good thing that might lead us to better answers. So moving on, it's my pleasure to introduce Ruby Johnson, who is a feminist activist, strategist, and social justice consultant committed to redistributing resources and power to feminist movements. She is the former co-executive director of FREEDA, the Young Feminist Fund, and is currently co-leading the Global Resilience Fund at Purposeful and working as an independent consultant with a range of feminist funders and organizations. So Ruby, our question for you today as our final panelist is, can you share something about your experience in shifting and sharing power and centering care in feminist organizations and funds? Have you found ways that help align values and practices in your work? And what are some of the biggest challenges that have been faced in this process?
Thank you so much, Srilatha. And yeah, thank you for inviting me to be part of this conversation, and to all the amazing panelists. And also just want to start by acknowledging the traditional owners, past and present, of the land that I'm joining from, Gadigal land. And yeah, during the next sort of little time that I have, I'm going to share some of my experience working with feminist funders, with Frida Resilience Fund, as Srilatha said, and just from being a free radical. And I think probably the first thing I wanted to start is really, emphasizing the need to make space for acknowledging, reflecting and interrogating our own power and privilege, as an individual, but also at a collective and organizational level. I think for me, this has been a really non-linear journey of unlearning, understanding, and of political education. And it's never really done, I think. And, when we talk about power and privilege, on the one hand, being a funder, naming the power dynamics, what comes with moving resources, and thinking through how to be really in deep solidarity and accountability to movements that you're funding. But also, for me personally, recognizing I'm a white, able-bodied woman from the global north, and just really acknowledging that I myself have benefited from the privileges, racist systems that a part of, and channeling that anger and shame into actions to shift power. So my 2-year-old's just appeared in the doorway. Hopefully he won't interrupt. But yeah, channeling that into shifting power and practice through systemic changes. So, and for me, that that's meant decentering myself, listening, but also personal and structural accountability. So creating policies and practices, and I'll share a bit more about some of those, but also seeding relationships and friendships of trust, and that enable sort of feedback and vulnerability. So, and I think in terms of some of the challenges, I'm going to try and touch on as many of the challenges I can, because I think it's useful. But I think, working virtually, I think, many of us haven't seen each other for 1 to 2 years. I think we're working with people that we've never met in some cases. I think power dynamics reproduce in virtual settings in all sorts of funky and complex ways. And I think, really need tools like this guide, the modules, to be able to work through some of those tensions around power. And, I think as feminists, we sometimes have quite complex relationships with power, discomfort with being in power sometimes, all sorts of intergenerational trauma also shows up, and current trauma shows up in organizations. And something that I've found a lot is particularly working with quite a young team, just this kind of fear of failure, and that kind of what it can do to you in a virtual setting. And so I think, it's really important to create space for different communication styles, create, value different ways of knowing, different concepts of time, and really support people to communicate what they need in an organizational context, and create the sort of structural support for that to happen. So, and I think, it also means working with people who understand trauma-informed approaches. And I myself, have spent a lot of time unlearning perfectionism, and just kind of interrogating that, and just trying to create a lot of, safe spaces for honest conversation about feedback, and also full spectrum of mental health, what people are bringing to this work, particularly in the pandemic, but always. So then the second point I want to just move to, just conscious of time, just really underscoring the importance of working with communities who are most impacted to design revolutionary or liberatory policies and practices, and the decision-making models that weave accountability as well as decentralizing power. And I think, there's incredible examples around participatory decision-making models, activists sitting on boards, and co-leadership is an area I'm particularly passionate about, and my own experiences of co-leadership have really, I've seen it transform how power can be reorganized across whole organizations. And I think powerful examples, and another example just to share with my work with the Resilience Fund, it's I think we've had some real breakthroughs around disability rights and inclusion. And, part of that was by working with disability rights activists and disability rights organizations, such as Women Enable, Disability Rights Fund, from the very outset, and like designing the entire like application process in collaboration. But I think even then, you know, we thought we'd figured out a lot of the things, and then even recently at an event that we organized, like thought the space was inclusive, but then found, you know, that there are things we could have done better, just very, you know, technical things about pinning the sign language, having different things like that, and just recognizing that like need to have a willingness to make mistakes and to sort of move through that and to learn and then change and commit the resources also to do that work. And I think it's a learning process. And I think, you know, some of the biggest challenges or like sources of tension I think I've seen in organizations can come from like lack of clarity around, so like lack of information flow, but also lack of clarity around how decisions are being made. So, and I think when you combine that with, you know, a trust deficit or power imbalances, like it can be really catastrophic. So I think one of my biggest learnings is the need to be really clear on what decision-making kind of method you're using, and whether that's consensus, whether that's, you know, some delegated group, or whether it's, you know, one person, and just be really clear and authentic about that. So I think that's been a big learning I've had, and that, oh my, I'm already 6 minutes.
Yes, I'm going to have to ask you, I'm so sorry, Ruby, to try and wind up in the next 30 seconds.
Oh my gosh. Okay. I was like exactly timed to 10 minutes, but that's okay. That's fine. So, I mean, maybe just to add a few things very quickly so yeah, around decision-making, I would say that we're just in a moment where shared leadership is gaining momentum, but, you know, there's huge challenges around hierarchy still being the dominant. And just, I think that there are examples at this moment and ways that we can sort of learn from that in the pandemic, that there's sort of new opportunities at present. And I was going to share an example around centering care with Frida, the Happiness Manifesto. So I'm just going to drop it in the chat. It's an example of like one of the ways that a resource and a way that you can bring care into your organization, just as an offering to the space. But yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. Sorry to rush you there, but thank you so much. I think some really useful and powerful insights. I think especially about, I think what you're implying is that we also need to be patient with mistakes, patient with ourselves and patient with each other. And I think often what happens is a lot of tension and conflict arises because we rush to judgment of things that didn't go perfectly well, because along with the messiness, we require non-judgmental responses that are more supportive and, you know, not about rushing to a judgment. Okay, so we are now going to move to our Q&A session. We have several questions that are already posted here, and I'm sorry that we have so little time, maybe about 10 minutes before we wrap up, but I'm going to use my prerogative as the moderator and maybe just pick some of the questions and ask someone to respond to them, any of the panelists or Bettina or Sudarsana. The first question is, what are the risks and opportunities the toolkit offers when it comes to people who want to use the resources in organizations that may not identify as feminist? That's a really interesting question. Is there anything we can learn from, you know, how gender mainstreaming has been done in the sector? But the concern is that there are lots of toolkits and resources that have been created, but they get diluted and neutralized in certain institutional settings. In other words, they get divested of their feminist politics. So this is one question. I was wondering if either Sudarsana or Bettina would like to address this, or anyone else.
So, you know, one of the things that we mentioned, and it is a concern, and you've raised a very valid point of having sort of this range of toolkits And it then becomes sort of, follow the guide and follow the manual. What we do want to emphasize is that this is not a prescriptive process, and the process itself matters, right? How are we kind of actually thinking about undertaking a feminist capacity building, and how are we actually thinking about engaging people across the staff, the board, everybody, other stakeholders, in terms of the process. So what we have in terms of the toolkit is really prescriptive. It is really kind of for each organization to take and make it their own in their own context. At no point should this be taken as, saying that this is the sort of process from end to end that needs to be followed. And definitely kind of thinking about who are you involving in. Betty kind of mentioned a lot of this about really being intersectional, making sure that you're always reflecting your own power as you kind of develop and run the feminist organizational capacity process. As facilitators, we know, we've been doing facilitation for so long that facilitators hold a lot of power, right? And as we kind of even roll those out, we must be very cognizant of those power dimensions within the organization at every level. Yeah, Bettina, if you want to add to that.
Bettina, anything to add? Okay, great. All right. So we have another question from Sachini Pereira on what are your thoughts on how do you dismantle or rebuild the kind of traditional, conventional organizational structures and hierarchies that we tend to bring with us from the corporate or patriarchal structures that we've been a part of. And I guess implied in the question is that sometimes we unconsciously reproduce these. Betty, do you want to take that one on? You actually spoke to this, but if you want to address this more specifically.
Very briefly, I guess. And I think it's about constantly unlearning and then relearning and remaining adaptable. Things change and we have to change with movements, have to change with time. And that's just the nature of movement. And if we are to strengthen our movements, we need to be adaptable. So I think it's not an easy process. I think there's a lot of internalized things that come into human rights and development workspace that takes a long term, that takes a longer term to sort of dissect. But I think I think Ruby and Sudarsana, you've also mentioned that there are resources available already. We have abundance of resources available now to be able to do this better than ever before. So going forward, I think we have the tools, and I'm happy for somebody else to sort of step in.
I think
yes, and I think, sorry, go ahead.
Only to add to Betty that I think the concept of messiness that has been touched on several times is a critical one, in the sense that I think we bring a lot of self-judgment and judgment to each other in this sort of striving for very high standard that value-driven organization, feminist organizations have. I think Ruby touched on it in terms of the unlearning this perfectionism. And so, that notion of constantly trying to be the next best version of ourselves, for me, is a language I find really helpful, because it allows for the mistakes and the learning and the messiness.
Thanks, Bettina. Thanks for quoting me on that. Okay. Then we have a question about language. Does the toolkit deal with the challenge of language that is a barrier to some people to feel safe to speak out or to challenge respectfully? And here I think there are two layers of the question. It's not just about language in the sense of how do I do this in Khmer or how do I do this in Sinhala. I think it's about also finding the words with which to do it in a way that I deem, culturally appropriate, without coming across as, rude or insolent. This is a major consideration in many cultures, as you know, where challenging doesn't happen because it's considered very rude and discourteous, for instance, to question an older person and so on. So anyone would like to take on the language issue? Pisey?
Thank you, Srilatha. I reflected before this webinar by reading the books, and in reality, I think we should not be afraid of trying something new. You know, why feminists are so creative? Because we are never afraid of experimenting anything. I just talked to the co-organizer on the other day that when we don't have something to guide us, we complain a lot. Why don't we have this guy and that guy? And when we have this module as the guide, we say, oh, this is the big paper, this is English, this is somebody create a new framework and concept. So what do we want exactly? We want a guidance or we don't want a guidance? I think it's important for us, for me at ROC is a management level. Do you see something useful from this document or any document? You have a duty of care. So can you adopt something? And can you learn from your own as a management before you translate it into your own team? You know your team best, right? You are not God. God also make mistakes if there is a true God. So why don't you go there and try something just a little bit to smell, like you taste the wine or right wine or anything. It does not hurt. So if you are not there to try, how do you know that it hurts or it's sexy or it's glamorous? And so, you know, it's full of potential. So I think we know our organization culture, we know our country's context, just try. But don't be afraid. Like somebody in our friend, I think Betty or Misha said, you are not alone. You try together. It's fun. So I believe so.
Thank you, Pisey. Excellent answer. Bettina, I'm going to throw this one at you. We probably have time only for, let's say, two more. One is whether IWDA, and I'd request you to answer this as briefly as possible. Do you have any examples or case studies about how the toolkit has been used already, such as within IWDA itself? And what are some of the challenges to using the toolkit?
So we did test the toolkit back in October 2018 with the whole of organization. So we brought at the time nearly 50 people together, and part of testing it involved, you know, some of that learning and messiness. We did have really clear, so we used the assessment part of the toolkit, and so that really gave us some very tangible priorities at the time of what needed to be focused on. And in fact, this year, we've done a whole organizational culture review, and a lot of actually what the toolkit told us in 2018 came back still in 2020 and in 2020 and 2021, and actually reposition some of those priorities much more clearly. So actually, it's been very helpful for us. We are going to use it again later this year or early next year as a kind of milestone point to assess how we are progressing against those objectives we've given ourselves on our organizational culture review.
Okay, thank you. So this is the last question. We have some very interesting comments as well in the Q&A pane or sharing of insights. I'd invite all of you to read that. I'm sorry that we can't tackle all the questions, including some very big ones like how do you tackle internalized misogyny? Or, you know, the really tough question Anuradha Rajan has raised about how do you balance demanding accountability from each other with being non-judgmental, a very tough one. So let's end with perhaps a simple but important question. Are there any criteria for choosing who can be on the board of a women's rights or feminist organization? And I think also what are the sort of ways in which, I'm sorry, lost my thread there for a minute. Okay, so let's begin with that. Who's eligible? How do we decide who's eligible to join the board of directors of a women's rights organization?
You don't select the dictator to be your on board of your feminist organization. That easy.
Anyone else?
I was Ruby here. Yeah, just to give
How
a quick.
about a toolkit with criteria for board members?
That's a good start. I was also going to, with Frida's example, we had the grantees and the advisors like vote and decide like who is on the board. So obviously people would need to nominate, but the actual decision was like decentralizing power in that way as well and held by the community. So it was like a powerful example.
Yeah, that's something similar to what we did at the Fiji Women's Fund when we had to put together a trust deed, which was like a legal document for registration, was to conduct consultation and get feedback from our partners and allies on, you know, who should make up the board, what are the skills and experiences needed. And there was this interesting question, right? Do you have to identify as a feminist to be on a feminist organization? And it's something that I've always also, you know, kind of tried to explore a bit. And for me, I think it's one of uncomfortableness. So I'll admit that. But at the same time, I think that it's good to have people who don't necessarily agree with you and see the world in a different perspective altogether, because even that is valuable and it shakes you up, but you also shake their world. And there have been some instances where I've been on boards or have members join a feminist organization board who don't label themselves as feminists, but years later, they are open about being feminist and they talk about why they now call themselves being feminist. So it's almost like conscious raisingness as well. Yeah. But I have to admit, it's still one, even when we were looking for board members, I'm a bit uncomfortable about. And, you know, like you kind of have to talk about it. What's the uncomfortableness in that? What's the risk? But also what's the opportunities of having that person on the board?
Right. Very true. And I think how do we then err on, we end up often erring on the other side of just keeping our board members for decades because of the discomfort of change, which is also something we are challenging organizations not to do, right? To have the turnover, to have new people coming in, but then it creates new. So thank you so much. Thank you to all our participants for the excellent questions and the very, very interesting insights and experiences that you've shared, both in the chat pane and in the Q&A box. I'm so sorry that we couldn't get to everything. So before I hand over to Bettina for a final word, and knowing that we are running 5 minutes late already, I'm not going to try and wrap up. I know that there were certain themes that must have resonated with all of us, perhaps most powerfully that the river runs muddy before it runs clear, that we have to work with intentionality and transparency, that the toolkit and the exercises in it and the concepts, etc., these are all simply sort of guides and possible pathways. It's not the final answer to everything. And in fact, let me add a little blurb, especially to any donors who are present, that this is by no means the final word, this toolkit. I think it's also a process. It's unfolding itself. And I think IWDA and Gender at Work would probably welcome resources to create a toolkit 2.0. So please do consider that if there are any donors in the room. I think we are also taking away a profound lesson of embracing and being patient with messiness and understanding that we find the solutions only by walking through it, that building solidarity, building a sense of community is vital, whether it's in our boards or our organizations or with our communities. And finally, that in all our processes, we make an effort to do two things: understand the role of ourselves, our own care, our own well-being or ill-being in the kind of power dynamics that we generate, but we also understand ourselves as holders of power, as enactors of power, and as we become conscious of that, we learn to transform ourselves and transform our processes. So thank you all again on my behalf, and thank you to IWDA for inviting me to moderate this absolutely fabulous webinar. Learned so much. And over to you, Bettina, for the final word.
Thank you. I think you've said it all, Srilatha. I will just add that the link to the website and where you can download Folks Toolkit is in the chat thread. And as you actually alluded, said in the spirit of properly valuing feminist knowledge creation work, we have a sliding cost scale to ensure these resources are actually fully accessible for grassroots organization. So for small and grassroots organization, the toolkit is completely free, but we ask that larger organization and individuals who have some resources make a small contribution if you can to support access for all. And as you said, Srilatha, we're really keen to receive feedback. We're really keen to also revise the toolkit, in a post-COVID world and add further tools to the package. I understand that there might be, and there is donors attending today. And so if you want to contribute to enable this Fox 2.0, well, please get in touch. We're assuredly not asking for support to make this work possible. So with that, again, I want to thank you all and thank you all the panelists for joining today and wishing you really well on your organizational change journeys. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Farewell to all. Stay safe, be well.